I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today, we're going to be talking about a person and I think a topic that has not been studied enough when we think about the American Revolution, the American founding, and the early years of the Republic. We're going to talk about financing the American Revolution, the important role that finance and financiers, and particularly one financier, played in the founding and the creation of the American Republic. I'm going to be joined for that conversation today by Richard Vague. Richard is an author of a wonderful book, also president of a company, so he knows the business side of things, but as a historian, he's an author of a wonderful book that I have to recommend heartily to our listeners called The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy. It's going to be an interesting conversation today. Glad you could be with us, Richard, on The American Idea.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we should start with this. It is an interesting fact that when we think about American history, especially the American Revolution and founding, we think of politicians and generals. We think of course, General Washington. We think of politicians like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. We don't often think of someone like Thomas Willing. In fact, I think probably a lot of our listeners who are pretty historically informed may have never heard of him or may have heard of him only in passing. So maybe we should start with this. Who was Thomas Willing?
Well, I did not know who he was either, and I count myself a student of the American Revolution, but he had the largest merchant trading firm in America, based out of Philadelphia. His junior partner was Robert Morris. The firm was called Willing, Morris and Company, and some folks may know Robert Morris's name. He dominated Philadelphia economically. He was the guy that was called on for things like chairing the Stamp Act protest, and he played a significant role in financing the revolution, including at a crucial moment starting the nation's first bank, along with Morris and a number of other folks, in 1781, at a point when the Continental currency had effectively lost all of its value. He did a tremendous job with that bank, such that he was actually selected after the Constitution came into being the nation's first central banker. As you'll recall, Hamilton had proposed the Bank of the United States. Thomas Willing was president of that bank and a close colleague of Hamilton's.
The years of what I find fascinating about your book, it spans a number of decades from before the Revolution all the way into the early Republic. And can you take us back to America in the 1770s? And revolution, of course, has been sort of brewing, but nobody's really talking about independence until we get into the early 1770s. Where is Willing in sort of the revolutionary atmosphere that's brewing, including in places like Philadelphia, when we're in the late 1760s and early 1770s?
Well, he was the leader in Philadelphia of all the economic boycotts. He led the boycott against the Stamp Act, the Sugar and Currency Acts. A couple of years later, the Townsend Acts. The merchant community and the country as a whole rejected those, and the weapon they used was an economic boycott. He was the individual that did a lot of the coordination of that, particularly in Pennsylvania. And you may recall that things got very dicey economically in that period. In 1772, there was a major financial crisis in London that spilled over into the United States and soured everyone's mood even that much more. And being a merchant and a lender, he was in the middle of that as well.
Obviously, as a prominent merchant in Pennsylvania, Does he have connections with well-known figures like Benjamin Franklin?
Absolutely, he has all those connections. He knows Franklin well. He had been both an ally and an adversary of Franklin's. It was the two of them that went out in 1763 to Germantown to face off with the Paxton Boys, and that what I consider really the beginning of the Revolutionary period. Um, Franklin actually complimented his banking skills later on. But he knew all those folks, including Washington, and was right in the middle of that milieu.
So as we come into 1776, Tom Paine's pamphlet is published in the very beginning of 1776. The move toward independence starts building steam. In your book, you talk about Willing and his position vis-a-vis those who are arguing, for example, for immediate unconditional independence. What's the situation like with him in Philadelphia in 1776 as far as independence goes?
He is a wealthy merchant and he has been making money hand over fist for decades. And he's not alone, the entire Philadelphia merchant community. You may recall that the century within which the revolution occurs is the biggest economic boom in world history. We go from a GDP of essentially nothing in that century to one that's a third of mighty Britain's. We go from a couple of 100,000 inhabitants to 5 million. It's an incredible time. These folks didn't want to separate from England. They were doing business with merchant traders over in London. And oh, by the way, there were a whole lot of merchants in London that didn't want the war or this conflict either. But what had been happening since really the 1720s and 30s is that Scotch-Irish Presbyterians had been flooding into the country, and not just Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, but other what we might call renegades, folks that had been oppressed by the English for centuries. They came into the country and they ended up being kind of the middle and lower classes in the western parts of these states. They hated the English. They wanted independence. And so Willing and his wealthy cronies and these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians actually have a virtual political civil war in which the Assembly, the government of Pennsylvania, actually acts in 75 to prohibit its delegates for voting for independence. That's how serious this opposition was at that moment.
Yeah, one of the things you note in the book is the social revolution aspect of the American Revolution, that there is this undercurrent of social conflict, as you were just suggesting there. And Willing, is he a sort of passive part of the financial aristocracy, or is he really, being the largest merchant, really an active part of that sort of aristocratic element in the city?
You know, he's about as active as you can get, not in a way that is trying to intentionally oppress anyone else in the country. He's just wealthy and consumed with the trading activity. He grows the firm that he inherited from his father 70 times during his lifetime. He grows a fortune of 26,000 to a million. So he's busy, but it's just a byproduct of that his focus and the focus of the middle and lower classes are in opposition to each other.
So how do we get a guy who's got a lot of interests in preserving the British Empire and imperial connections? How do we go from that to a guy who, as you say, is a financier of the revolution?
Well, it actually starts before the vote for independence, because in the moments after the Battle of Bunker Hill, what is clear is that the U.S. is about to run out of gunpowder. And the king and parliament recognize this and are actively destroying the caches of gunpowder they think that the colonies have access to. And there's really one firm that takes the lead, and this is in 75. There's one firm that takes the lead in going out through their smuggling connections throughout the Caribbean, all the way up to the Dutch and the French in Europe. They've had these well-established, decades-long smuggling connections, and they use their personal credit to procure gunpowder and, to a lesser extent, guns in those all-important first few months. And, they follow up by actually, really the day after the vote for independence, Willing is all in. He voted against it, but now that it's happened, he's on board. And his soon to be son in law is sent to the Caribbean to start to raise money for the revolution by privateering and capturing British merchant ships. He captures over 200,
Wow.
sells them, disposes of the proceeds, and sends the money back to Philadelphia to finance the war.
What role does Willing then take on as the war goes on from 1776? How exactly does, obviously, there's the privateering that happens. What else? How is he actually helping to provide funding for the military effort?
Well, he procures gunpowder, he procures weapons, he procures supplies. He's really, there were so many wars in that century that guys like Willing knew how to operate their businesses. He'd operated his business through the French and Indian War. So he continues to do that. The government, Continental Congress, is really set up as a series of committees. And I can't remember how many committees Willing was on, but he was on the committee of safety, he's on the committee of procurement, he's on several dozen committees between the state government and the Continental Congress. So he's about as active as you can get. And when, in a very controversial move, the British come and occupy Philly in 77, most of the leaders go west to Lancaster and Yorktown. Willing stays, and it's very controversial, but he stays in part to keep his firm intact because it's continuing to procure supplies.
So I think our listeners would be really interested in that fact because they might think, is it interesting that the British, I mean, for example, did the British arrest him?
Well, the British had this impossible task to prosecute a war and win the hearts and minds of the colonies at the same time. So Howe, comes in and, it announces in advance, we're going to leave you alone. We're going to take care of you. Don't worry about it. And they immediately go to Willing. And by the way, try to get him to take the oath of allegiance to the king, which he refuses to do. But it's this weird thing that we've experienced many times since then when you're trying to prosecute a war and trying to win over the populace at the same time. Willing manages to navigate that, even though not without suspicion from both sides.
Yeah, I was wondering. So, what happens with his relations with members of Congress? Because obviously, we know from letters from General Washington, for example, from the field, complaining about Congress all the time and Congress's inaction in helping to fund the war effort. How was Willing able to maintain relations with members of Congress?
Well, Congress is divided from the get-go. There's no moment when everybody's singing from the same, hymnal, as it were, metaphorically. You see the seeds of what become the Federalists and Anti-Federalists a decade later. And so, and the Federalists are out of Philly, and Tom is a Philadelphian. And most of the anti-Federalist activity, at least at that juncture, is out of Virginia. So he and his colleague Robert Morris and Silas Deane, as you may recall, and others are criticized almost continually. There's deep acrimony within Congress from the beginning, but Willing manages to navigate it without getting too scuffed up, as it were.
As the war draws to a close, of course, and this is something that you note in your book, and of course, other historians have noted as well, which is financing a revolution often requires taking on a lot of debt. And the issue of debt is one of the most significant issues post-Revolutionary War and into the Constitution making period. What is the situation as far as debt goes and Willing's place in the debts that have accrued in term for financing the war effort?
Well, the number is about $70 million in 1980 or $1783. And the economy is, let's call it 200 to 250 million. So 70 million in a $250 million economy is the equivalent of $7 or $8 trillion in 2026. So it is a lot of money. And folks who have been buying these securities or being paid with scrip, which is the equivalent, or the soldiers that are being paid with scrip, start complaining almost immediately because there's never any money to even pay interest. So if you bought a $100,000 U.S. government bond in 1779, let's call it, you're getting no interest paid on it. And one of the consequences is that bond is now trading at 10 to 20 cents on the dollar. So your $100,000 bond is only worth $10,000 or $20,000. You're getting no cash flow. And in those days, for some families, that was their only source of cash. So there is a crescendo that gets louder and louder and louder through the decade, starting in 81, 82, 83. And guys like Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris penned 15,000 word treatises on why you should pay us interest. But the Continental Congress is not set up to make decisions like that. It has no power to tax. And all 13 colonies have to vote yes to give it the power of tax. And that never happens. So guess what? They do an end run and call up for a meeting called the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and solve that problem with that Constitution.
Right. So tell us, that's so interesting. I think we forget the important role of debt in driving the convention that leads to the Constitution. Where is Willing in the politics of that decade of the 1780s? Is he one who says, wait a minute, to be a real country, an independent republic, does he adopt the Hamiltonian view that we really need to get our finances in order? We need to be able to take care of our debt. We have to have proper, not only private finance, but proper public finance?
Without question. These are the Philadelphia Federalists. This is Thomas Willing, his son-in-law, William Bingham, their very close associate, Alexander Hamilton, who actually lives across the street from Willing during the crucial early years under the Constitution. They both live close to 3rd and Walnut, for you Philadelphians that are listening. So they have an absolute belief in this, and they argue it vociferously. Now, Thomas Willing was mayor and assemblyman and justice before 1776. When he votes against the Declaration of Independence in 76, that effectively takes him out of the ability to run for office anymore. So he kind of steps into the background, and his public face in these are folks like his dear friend and attorney, James Wilson, who many of us think of as the father of the Constitution, Robert Morris, Hamilton, Bingham, and the like. But yeah, they're the guys that want centralized government. They want debt to be paid off at par or face value. And it's really the Virginians as much as anything that begin to take the opposite view. And that's, of course, Jefferson, Madison, and the like.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to learn a little more about the Ashbrook Center and how you can help us continue our work with teachers, students, and citizens.
I'm Chad Kiefer, Director of Philanthropy and Strategic Partnerships here at Ashbrook. At its heart, America's story is about the lives of patriots who have given their last full measure of devotion to preserve and protect what it means to be an American. But the tragic truth is that the American story is being rewritten as one of oppression and despair. Back in 1776, the founders took a chance when they created a new government built on principles of liberty. They took a chance on America. Now I'm challenging you to do the same. Your gift to Ashbrook today reaches students, teachers, and citizens across the country, helping them to understand why America is worthy of their devotion. With so many forces eroding our history and taking away from our principles, isn't it time we give America a chance? Your investment is encouraged now more than ever. Please visit us today at ashbrook.org/support.
He grows, even though he is politically perhaps not popular enough as a result of that vote against independence. You do note in the book that he nevertheless maintains a very significant position with among the Federalists and has a kind of um, behind the scenes power. And that, in fact, to the point that even someone like John Adams complains about his power over people like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, which is a pretty remarkable claim considering nobody thought that anybody could boss George Washington around.
Well, there's no question that, and we all know how cantankerous John Adams is, but he writes a letter in 1813 where he basically says Willing and his crowd governed Washington and Hamilton. Obviously there was an exaggeration there, but, there's truth in every statement like that. And one of the powers that Willing had, which was the very reason folks like Jefferson feared his banking position so much, is that Willing was viewed as someone who could coerce a vote by the threat of not granting a loan or not renewing a loan. This was one of the reasons the Anti-Federalists were so opposed to banking to begin with. And, whether it was true or not, it was something that was widely believed. And there were critical things, the chief among them being the ratification of the Constitution itself, which, even though today we almost think of that as an afterthought, that was a virulent struggle. That came to become a physical struggle in places like New York State.
Right.
And Willing and his son-in-law Bingham were absolutely active in that. And Willing and his family members led the July 4th parade after enough states had voted to ratify the Constitution. There were 10. So this huge celebration on the Delaware River with 10 ships and troops and everything else. And the Willings were among those leading that parade, celebrating the ratification of the Constitution. But he was also, his same influence was felt in the ratification of the Jay Treaty just a couple of years later, which was highly unpopular and really met the needs of the merchant trading community as opposed to the agriculturalists, the plantation owners. So he was there.
You've spoken a couple of times about the Philadelphia financial aristocracy, and on the other side, some of the Virginians, people like Thomas Jefferson, maybe James Madison, among others. What was Jefferson and Madison's relationship with Willing, or at least their views of him?
Well, it's very interesting because underneath it all, Willing was very gracious. And folks reacted to him that way. And there's this picture of Thomas Jefferson as president in Philadelphia. And he's surrounded by his political enemies. And he longs to be back in Virginia with his friends. He's shunned, people actively on the Federalist side. You get this picture of this social loneliness that Jefferson experiences. Now, he was a little bit of a loner to begin with, as we know. And there's this very poignant letter that we have a copy of where Willing invites him to, a ball. And Jefferson, politely declines him. But both Jefferson and his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, who is one of the heroes of the early Republic, remark on the fact that in the middle of all the other vitriol, Willing and Bingham continued to be very open and warm and gracious towards them.
Yeah. Does that surprise you? I mean, you've had a chance to study this man as a person. Does it surprise you that he would be open and gracious like that, given his strong political and social views? Or is that just the kind of person he was?
Yeah, I think about that relative to people today. And the difficulty of having strong views and yet remaining warm and gracious in that context. I think that's one of the lessons of Thomas Willing, is at the end of the day, he was willing to sign on and compromise and move forward in the middle of all this vitriol. John Adams called him, the most gracious man and most gracious and agreeable man. And, and Adams ultimately, developed lots of suspicion about him, but in his personal contact, in his public demeanor, Willing is, I think, someone who's a good example for us all.
Of course, the subtitle of your book is Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy. What role did he play in that rise?
Well, I think his family was a big part of it. You know, he had lots of sisters and brothers. His father had died when he was in his early 20s. And he had, 10 brothers and sisters at that point in time. And he was a very young man. And then he himself had 10 surviving children who, grew up to have very advantageous marriages. And, there was a lot of intermarriage among the wealthy in that era, just like other periods of history we're familiar with. So his influence was pervasive and profound. His daughter, Anne Willing Bingham, becomes the head of Philadelphia society. You hear the term Republican court. Well, the Republican court is his daughter's doing. And she has actually traveled to Europe with her husband, William Bingham, and comes to be viewed as the most beautiful woman in Europe and America.
Wow.
They sell miniature portraits of her in the galleries of London. She brings the masquerade ball back to Philadelphia and America, where it becomes wildly popular. She dresses to the nth degree at all times. They throw parties at the Bingham residence several times a week. The Federalist caucus, which is the first caucus in American political history, happens in Anne's living room. So their influence is widespread and fairly profound.
What about on some of the issues of the early republic that, as this financial aristocracy in Philadelphia is growing, of course, there are other political issues that the country faces in the early 1800s. I'm thinking, for example, of the sectional conflict with New England versus the other rest of the country with respect to relationships with Britain. To some extent, the beginning percolations of the regional conflict over slavery. Where is Willing and his family on these kind of issues?
Well, I will tell you that, even though, as we've talked about, the history books tend to polish all this up, America is a very rambunctious and contentious place from the very beginning. And I don't care whether you call that beginning 1776 or you call that beginning 1787. America is rambunctious, speculation abounds, political divisions are acrimonious. So, they're kind of in the middle of it all. Now, my own view is that, Willing kind of keeps his composure in the middle of all of this, but it swirls around him. And I think one of the very interesting things is, Washington takes his oath in 89. We have our first financial crisis in 1791. We have our second financial crisis in 92. We have our third financial crisis in 96, all in a period where the economy is doubling in size. So the two things can coexist. And so there's a real need for people to keep their wits about them in the middle of, I like to think of it as Americans are American right from the beginning. and kind of in the middle of all that, if you can have folks that know how to keep their composure, it helps immensely.
I think our listeners would be really interested to know, you mentioned that series of financial crises in the 1790s. As you said, Willing has grown his fortune by 70 times over the course of his lifetime. I think it'd be really interesting for us to understand how was he able to navigate those financial crises as a merchant and a financier and come out with he and his family's fortune growing even larger?
It's a great question for 1790, and it's a great question for 2026. And, we know what the things are. You keep enough liquidity in reserve. Don't go too far out of bounds. He, for example, will not speculate in real estate. Real estate becomes the game.
Oh, I was going to ask that question about, for example, Western land speculation.
Wealthy Americans go crazy over buying land in the West. and they buy hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of acres on credit. It's financed by the selling government. So Willing manages to resist that and really acquires comparatively little, and it's all income producing, or almost all income producing. His friends, William Bingham and Robert Morris, go way beyond that. I think Robert Morris ends up owning something like 6 million acres of land, which he's unable to support financially, and he ends up in debtor's prison. Which, by the way, if you've been to Independence Hall, is right across Walnut Street. It's called the Prune Street Jail. It's a debtor's prison. He goes there and ends his life penniless. Willing is able to say no to himself. He's willing to take second place if that's what it takes to preserve some level of financial liquidity.
So the generations that follow him. I know your book goes up through, sort of the early Republic period, but this American financial aristocracy, sort of headquartered, as it would be in Philadelphia, at least at the time, generations after him, is he remembered in that financial community as one of the pillars of it? And, there's paintings on the wall of him, and there's memories of him, and there's stories of him. Or is he sort of forgotten to history?
I wrote a book on the business history of the United States a few years ago, really covering the period from the founding through about 2023. And I would make the observation that almost all business leaders over that 250 plus year span are forgotten. I tell my business friends today, I said, enjoy things while you can, because nobody's going to remember you. They remember politicians, they remember generals, they remember entertainers. Business folks, with, a few obvious exceptions, Thomas Edison, we all know who he was, and a couple of others. But by and large, the titans of each period of history are by and large forgotten.
Help us understand that, because that's really a remarkable fact when you consider how much a person like Thomas Willing contributed to the Republic and the founding of the Revolution, the founding of the Republic, and into the 19th century. They do have such a significant contribution, not just to Philadelphia, but to the whole country. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's probably several reasons, but one of those reasons is that I think historians, by and large, don't understand business and are a little bit intimidated. So if you're talking about Thomas Willing, you're into debt financing, you're into capital ratios, you're into, all these things, which I think a lot of folks, their eyes glaze over. And yet, to get to an earlier point that you made, in the middle of the Revolution, folks like George Washington are saying, in war, the longest purse determines the outcome. They had figured out, by the time you got to 1780, that they didn't have to win the war. All they had to do was not lose. And not losing was a matter of getting enough financing to carry through. And guys like Willing were integral to that. So, it's not the Battle of Yorktown. It's not the Battle of Saratoga. But it was the most important fact about the Revolution. By the way, a little side note, it was costing Britain 3.5 to 4 times much more per annum to prosecute the war than it cost America. So at the same time, we're having all our travails. There's a virtual political civil war in London by folks that didn't want, King George III to continue fighting the war.
I think we forget that sometimes, as you say. Absolutely. Maybe this is an unfair question as we end our time together, but fascinating historical figures like this, who were once so prominent, there always seems to me that when I've talked to authors like you who have really gotten to know someone really well, there's always something that surprises them about that person. Maybe it's an unfair question, but in your research on Thomas Willing, was there anything that you thought, wow, I never saw that before? That was really surprising about him.
Well, the vote against the Declaration. I do a lot of economic research, and banking and the leverage associated with banking is a very pivotal fact if you really want to understand economic truths. So I was going back to the origins of banking in America to try to figure out, how these ratios were derived and what the issues were. And this fact popped up that he voted against the Declaration of Independence. And I'm almost mortified for the guy. He said, what in the world happened?
Yeah.
And I was hoping I could kind of bury that fact. But the more I kind of picked at it, the more this huge story of the social divisions in America came true. But let me tell you, I wasn't prepared to have my protagonist vote against the most sacred document at the most sacred moment in American history.
That makes it, as you say, a little bit more difficult to tell the story, but it's a more complex story. And I have to tell you, it is a fascinating story. To our listeners, let me highly recommend Richard Vague's wonderful book, The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy. Richard, thanks for being with us today for this really interesting discussion about a very fascinating character in the history of our republic. Thanks for joining us on The American Idea.
Thank you. I'm grateful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.